So blessings, my brothers and sisters and siblings in Ghana. My name is Marina, and I'm one of the coordinators of the Popular Education institution Somos Semillas, and I'm really happy and grateful really to be part of this GIPRAD these GIPRAD sessions. So a bit to share our context. So in Abya, which is the indigenous name of what we call Latin America. So what we're seeing right now is that, you know, our communities, our lands, our territories and nations continue to be subordinate to Western imperialism. You know, our lands are still concessioned to transnational private interests, and you know, when our communities actually take democracy into their hands, as is currently happening, you know, in Peru and in Bolivia, what we're seeing is that they're basically being couped, or for example, you know, criminal sanctions are put on our countries, like in Cuba and Venezuela. Not only this, but also, you know, like white supremacist development models, they continue to enact, you know, ecocide on our territories and you know, the genocide of our indigenous communities, as well as those indigenous institutions, you know, which function to preserve those indigenous knowledges, wisdoms, traditions and customs, and forms of autonomy and self-governance. And our communities of resistance are heavily being repressed for this. You know, on a daily basis, we're having siblings criminalized, assassinated, disappeared, you know, because they continue to organize and they're pronouncing themselves actively in defense of life and in defense of self-determination, which, you know, is a human right. So Somos Semillas as an institution basically emerged out of the need of these community processes of resistance on the continent, you know, the need for those to be popularized here in the diaspora, and seen amongst the diaspora as like legitimate and necessary vehicles of transformation and education, you know, that are making real advancements right now towards the liberation of our continents, you know, towards the self-determination, the sovereignty of our continents, you know, a just peace in our continents, and you know, where true people's democratic processes are respected, you know, in defense of our people's and Mother Earth's rights. And so, not only this, but like as Somos Semillas, we've also been working to actually vindicate and really instill a sense of pride amongst our diaspora communities of, you know, of our indigenous histories, our indigenous knowledges, and resistance efforts, you know, as like a primary first step in actually restoring our peoplehoods and thus combating, you know, the miseducation that is funneled into our communities pretty much on a daily basis, you know, by these Western miseducation institutions, you know, by mainstream media, you know, that basically, you know, manipulates and brainwashes the diaspora into disregarding and totally, you know, rechazando means like getting rid of, you know, and you know, not acknowledging, you know, illegitimizing their community knowledges and peoplehoods, and which actually makes the diaspora complicit in the continents and their own people's, you know, continued subjugation and promotion of white supremacism. So this institution, Somos Semillas, is one of Prela's, you know, community institutions, and so is really committed to what is this educational revolution that we are all part of. You know, a revolution that seeks to transform, you know, liberate education and democratize, and thus decolonize education into the service of our communities and thus our collective liberation efforts. And you know, there are really crucial intercultural educational exchanges to be had between our two continents, you know, between Africa, between Abya, and between our local communities, because, you know, the material conditions of our communities, they are actually very similar, they share a lot in common, and there are lessons and knowledges to be learned, you know, despite the cultural differences, or in spite of the cultural differences, you know, and those need to be shared between our resistance efforts, between our communities, so that we're effectively able to advance our people's struggles in a more coordinated way, in a holistic way, towards what we have learned by some of the Pan-African elders here and the African community institutions here, which is Ubuntudunia, that multipolar world of global justice. So one example of from the Abya Yalan context, like one of these, educational processes or knowledges that could be shared, for example, is how indigenous communities, for example, in Bolivia, have actually been organized to actually implement the political project of plurinationalism, where basically, indigenous nations are represented in decision-making processes, are present in decision-making processes, and are seen, acknowledged with their authority, as nations that come under that umbrella of plurinationalism, where their self-determination and sovereignty is respected. And so that's been, carried out in Bolivia and in Ecuador, and there are really crucial, educational learnings that have come out of this experience, that maybe would be, somewhat useful to hear about or to have dialogue, about. Another example of how students, for example, practically have been actually taking up this effort to liberate education in service of the masses of people in communities, is, for example, in Peru, around the current, mass mobilizations, anthropology students in the professional school for anthropology at the National University of Toribio Rodriguez de Mendoza in the Amazon in Peru. They basically put out a statement saying, that our educational institutions should be committed to advancing, practical solutions to the crisis that we are right now experiencing today. And that not only should they be advancing these practical solutions alongside community institutions, through co-knowledge production, but they should actually also have to, they need to play an active role in social change towards the building of, true, popular, intercultural, plurinational, democratic processes. So an example of what they're thinking is, like, for example, them as a university, they should be working in service of the people by supporting community assemblies, indigenous, Andean, Amazon, communities, workers, to actually, as students, they should be, systematizing demands and proposals that are coming out of these community assemblies, and actually bring those towards, for the construction of a popular, plurinational, constituent assembly, So, that these are just some examples of like educational processes happening out there. But, we have a lot to learn. I think Abya Yalasai is from the African continent, and we really want to learn those, We want to understand, for example, what are the planet repairs conversations that are happening on the ground right now, what learnings have also come out of the Pan-African struggle to build up Maatubuntuman, because, for example, Abya Yala, that concept in of itself, the word Abya Yala, it requires the unification of the continent, and that's also what Maatubuntuman has been working towards. And so, we want to understand, we want to hear about, what are the learnings that have come out of that movement, and we know ancestors, like Kwame Nkrumah, have taken up that direction, and we want to, learn, what are the community institutions that are still, about, and that are, having conversations, from their indigenous knowledges, with respect to their local knowledges around, around the needs, what actually is being moved on the ground, and we want to actually be building, better bridges of dialogue between our communities and our continents, and as Somos Semillas, I guess, as an institution of this popular education, we want to support our communities, resistance efforts, to be heard there in Africa, and we want to support that as a means for like that educational process to occur. But we also want, the opposite to happen. We want, in Abya Yala, them to actually hear about your community institutions and processes of resistance. and within that, there's a really important conversation to actually be had around like decolonization and reparations, and what that would also mean for institutions of miseducation here in the United Kingdom. Because, for example, universities like SOAS, it's a School of the Oriental and African Studies. I'm right now in SOAS. It was built as an institution, literally to analyze your continent, the African continent, in order to see, the most effective way for imperialist Britain to colonize Africa, and commit genocide and ecocide on communities. So this institution today stands, as a Mangamizi crime scene, and it names itself as being the world's university, and is being committed to a decolonizing vision that it's not implementing. And so these crime scenes, they continue to be sites of miseducation. And so basically for these institutions, these institutions have a necessity to commit to reparations. We need them to there must be a reparatory framework when we talk about this educational revolution, and that reparatory framework for these sites of miseducation must be to actually support educational processes towards anti-colonial resistance, to facilitate our liberation efforts. They should be supporting our anti-colonial liberation efforts and our emancipation efforts from Western imperialism. That's what their law department should be doing, their media departments. They should be freeing up their archives. Those archives have your community stories in them, and they have them locked away here. Those should be made accessible to your communities, to our communities. That's what we mean by the commoning of knowledge, and this has to be promoted. And they have to be promoting also like our intercultural education. They need to be recognizing our people's histories, our knowledges, our cosmovisions, and our community institutions of self-empowerment and self-defense. When our people implement their people's laws, that should be respected within these institutions as well. And so, siblings in Ghana, like what we really want you to know is like we want to know which community institution you want us to listen to, which community institutions out there, have you maintained, and where are you, actually, where do you want us to look to actually get direction? Because we want to hear that from you. We want to know, we want to work together, we want to work together towards our collective emancipation. And we know, just as our ancestors knew just 10 years ago, decades ago, and centuries ago, that our emancipation and our liberation efforts will only be fruitful if we're having these conversations, and if we're working together, because we know that it will only be a collective liberation, and so we require each other, and we know and believe, and that these educational processes, these dialogues, these sharing of knowledges, our commonings of knowledges will actually advance our people's efforts towards planet repairs, and towards our collective liberation, and so that's that. Thank you, family. Power, dignity, and solidarity, and we're really committed to working. We want to keep having these conversations. So blessings. In Aviala we say, for example, por un mundo en que quepan muchos mundos, which basically means for a world in which many worlds fit, or hasta que la dignidad se haga costumbre, until dignity becomes custom. So venceremos, we will win. Blessing, family.